Why U.S. prisons are more dangerous than ever. The cameras in the New York prison didn't lie. The grainy footage, later played in court, showed a restrained man, Robert Brooks, lying helplessly on the floor as uniformed officers surrounded him. He was no threat, no weapon in his hands, no sudden movement that could justify force. Yet the blows came anyway. Fists, boots, knees, over and over, until Brooks no longer moved. When the body cameras were later recovered, prosecutors would call the scene one of the most shocking betrayals of public trust in recent U.S. prison history. The men paid to keep order had become executioners. For those watching across the country, it was a reminder of something many already feared. America's prisons are not just failing, they are becoming more dangerous than ever before. To understand how the system reached this boiling point, you have to peel back the layers. The United States operates the largest prison system in the world, with nearly 2 million people incarcerated at any given time. Behind those concrete walls, overcrowding is more than just a statistic. It is daily chaos. Cells built for 2 hold 3 or 4. Day rooms spill over with restless men and women who spend 20 or more hours locked in confinement, only to be released into spaces brimming with tension. Add in the severe shortage of correctional officers, men and women stretched so thin they oversee dozens of inmates with little backup. And the results are predictable. Assaults break out in minutes. Knives made from sharpened toothbrushes slide into ribs. And at times, the very guards tasked with restoring order join the violence themselves. Robert Brooks' killing was shocking not only for its brutality, but for what it symbolized. A system unable to restrain itself. The officers charged in his death weren't rogue outliers. They were symptoms of a culture that has normalized aggression as a means of control. The footage became a rallying cry for reform advocates. But for inmates across the country, it was confirmation of what they already knew. Once the gates close behind you, survival isn't guaranteed. The truth is, American prisons have become pressure cookers. Decades of tough-on-crime policies swelled the population, but funding never matched the demand. By the 1990s, supermax prisons and mass incarceration campaigns filled facilities faster than they could be maintained. Toilets broke and stayed broken. Showers leaked. Mold spread. Meals shrank in size and quality, leading to hunger and sickness. What may sound like inconveniences outside those walls turn into sparks inside them. Inmates denied basic dignity lash out, forming gangs for protection, controlling contraband economies, and turning small disputes into wars. The violence isn't only inmate against inmate. In California, Gregory Rodriguez, a correctional officer at a women's prison, used his badge as a weapon. For years he preyed on women locked away with no means of escape, committing acts of sexual violence so severe that when he was finally brought to justice, the judge sentenced him to 224 years in prison. For many, the sentence wasn't just punishment. It was an indictment of a system that allowed him to abuse unchecked for so long. Behind these horrifying stories lies a deeper pattern. Staff shortages mean officers often work double or triple shifts. Exhaustion breeds anger, and anger explodes under stress. Many correctional facilities rely on inexperienced recruits with minimal training, thrust into environments where seasoned officers already bend the rules. A culture of silence, where whistleblowers risk retaliation, ensures misconduct thrives in the shadows. In states like Alabama, federal investigators found prisons so violent they were declared unconstitutional. The Department of Justice reported that men were routinely stabbed to death in broad daylight, their bodies discovered in showers, dormitories, and stairwells. Guards often ignored cries for help, and in some cases, inmates died simply because no one arrived in time. Families on the outside would get the dreaded phone call, learning their loved one hadn't just been incarcerated, they had been condemned to a battlefield. What makes U.S. prisons more dangerous today than in decades past isn't just the violence, but the normalization of it. Incarcerated men and women describe life inside as an endless state of alert, where sitting at the wrong table or looking at someone the wrong way could cost you your life. In places like Rikers Island in New York, the chaos has grown so bad that federal monitors have openly declared the facility unfixable. Riots, suicides, and drug overdoses are weekly headlines, and the city has promised to shut the jail down by 2027, though even that timeline is in jeopardy. For the families of victims like Robert Brooks, justice is slow and incomplete. Courtrooms replay the images of his final minutes, but no sentence can undo the fear rippling through prisons nationwide. Each case of brutality, each sexual assault, each stabbing chips away at the myth that incarceration is about rehabilitation or safety. Instead, America's prisons resemble forgotten war zones where human lives are disposable, and accountability rarely survives past the headlines. Yet the crisis continues to escalate. Rising drug smuggling through drones, increasing gang control of entire cell blocks, and collapsing infrastructure push the system closer to implosion. At one federal facility in Texas, investigators found holes in fences large enough to crawl through, while staff confiscated hundreds of weapons fashioned from everyday materials. Each discovery painted the same picture: prisons where order was an illusion and survival was the only law. But nothing shook the public's trust quite like the death of Robert Brooks. Watching officers, sworn protectors, deliver fatal blows to a restrained man ignited questions that reached beyond one prison. If this could happen to him, how many other acts of violence go unseen, hidden from cameras, never reported to the public? Families of inmates began asking what had long been whispered inside the walls. Are U.S. prisons protecting society, or creating dangers that will one day spill back into it? And then, just when it seemed the outrage might force change, another extreme event erupted. An event so violent, so deadly, that it would expose the crisis of American prisons in a way no press conference or government report ever could. It was early morning inside Alabama's William E. Donaldson Correctional Facility when chaos erupted. A dispute between rival groups of inmates, long simmering under the surface, exploded into a full-blown riot. Makeshift weapons, sharpened metal rods, broken broom handles, even pieces of plastic trays, flashed in the dim light as men lunged at one another. The few correctional officers on duty were quickly overwhelmed. Some locked themselves in offices for safety. Others tried in vain to radio for help as the violence spread across multiple dormitories. By the time order was restored hours later, several men were dead. Dozens more were injured, and the facility was left scarred with bloodstains on the floors and shattered glass in the hallways. The riot was not an isolated incident. Alabama's prisons have been under federal investigation for years, cited as among the most violent in the entire country. The Department of Justice reported rampant homicides, daily stabbings, and sexual assaults so common that some inmates described them as routine. For the men locked inside Donaldson that day, survival was not about rehabilitation, but about forming alliances strong enough to fend off the next attack. Families on the outside, waiting for updates, were forced to wonder whether their loved one would ever come home alive, even if they were serving time for non-violent offenses. When news of the riot reached national media, it shocked the public, but inside the prison system itself, no one was surprised. Overcrowding in Alabama has pushed prisons far beyond their intended capacity. Cells designed for one often house 2 or 3. Dormitories meant for 50 men now cram in 100. With so many bodies and so few staff, violence spreads like wildfire. Inmates speak of constant fear, never sleeping deeply, never eating without glancing over their shoulders, never trusting that the next step won't bring them face to face with a blade. This riot was just the most visible symptom of a disease running deep. Across the country, understaffing has hollowed out correctional facilities. Recruitment struggles have left vacancies unfilled, forcing officers to work exhausting shifts of 16 hours or more. In Mississippi, entire cell blocks have gone unpatrolled for days, allowing gangs to take de facto control. In Oklahoma, officers have admitted to releasing inmates early from lockdown not out of compassion, but simply because they were too tired to keep watch. Each lapse creates new opportunities for violence. And then there's the contraband. Drones dropping packages over fences, corrupt staff smuggling in cell phones and drugs. Every riot, every stabbing, every suicide builds toward a chilling truth. U.S. prisons are not under control. And while the riot at Donaldson may have been extreme, the nation was about to witness yet another eruption, one that would claim even more lives and push the prison crisis further into the national spotlight. As the country reeled from Alabama's chaos, news broke of another facility falling into darkness. A prison in Mississippi, where a fight between rival gangs escalated into one of the deadliest prison clashes in recent history. The images that leaked, smoke rising from rooftops, helicopters circling overhead, and ambulances lined up outside the gates, would confirm once more that America's prisons were spiraling out of control. Smoke billowed over the Mississippi Delta as helicopters circled the notorious Mississippi State Penitentiary, better known as Parchman. Inside its aging cell blocks, chaos had erupted into one of the bloodiest prison clashes in recent memory. Rival gangs turned open dormitories into war zones, swinging makeshift blades and metal pipes, using the darkness of faulty lights to ambush one another. Guards, outnumbered and under-equipped, pulled back, leaving men to fend for themselves. By the end of the week, at least 7 inmates were dead, dozens injured, and families stood outside the gates begging for answers. The Parchman massacre wasn't a random outbreak of violence. It was the culmination of years of neglect and warnings that went unheeded. Built in the early 1900s, Parchman was already notorious for its brutal history. Once run as a plantation-style labor camp, its reputation had always carried the stain of cruelty. By the 2020s, those old shadows merged with modern crises: overcrowding, collapsing infrastructure, and rampant gang rivalries. Reports from inside described conditions so inhumane that prisoners said they were living. The Department of Justice launched an investigation, but for many, it was too little, too late. Federal monitors had already flagged Mississippi prisons as dangerously underfunded and understaffed, with vacancy rates for correctional officers among the highest in the nation. In some units, a single officer watched over hundreds of men, an impossible task that all but guaranteed violence would flourish. With so little oversight, gangs filled the vacuum, operating like organized armies that controlled contraband markets and dictated survival rules inside the walls. Beyond Mississippi, the Parchman massacre served as a grim warning for the rest of the country. Across states like Georgia, Florida, and Texas, similar conditions festered. In Georgia's state prisons, inmates described entire dorms ruled by gangs, where those without affiliation were extorted for protection. In Florida, officers admitted they often avoided certain blocks altogether, leaving rival groups unchecked. In Texas, investigations revealed that gangs coordinated attacks across multiple units using contraband cell phones, effectively running criminal enterprises from behind bars. But as shocking as the Mississippi massacre was, what made it even more chilling was the aftermath. Survivors reported that in the days following the bloodshed, retaliation was swift and merciless. Some inmates were beaten by guards in crackdowns. Others were locked down in dark cells for weeks, with little food or water, while tensions continued to smolder just beneath the surface. Advocates warned that unless drastic reforms were made, the violence would not only repeat itself, but grow even worse. For Americans watching from the outside, the images of Parchman forced uncomfortable questions. If prisons are meant to protect society, what does it mean when those very institutions become breeding grounds for violence and debt? The crisis in Georgia drew the attention of the Department of Justice, which launched a sweeping civil rights investigation. Federal officials cited not only the staggering homicide rate, but also rampant reports of sexual violence, neglect, and retaliation against those who spoke out. The investigation painted a grim picture: prisons so violent and mismanaged that they violated the Constitution itself. But even as the probe continued, the killings didn't stop. Each new headline reinforced what families had been saying for years. Incarceration in America doesn't just mean time served. It can mean a death sentence. The violence wasn't limited to Georgia. Across the country, prisons mirrored the same collapse. In Florida, correctional facilities reported record overdoses as fentanyl and synthetic drugs poured in through smuggling routes. In California, riots in men's prisons left dozens hospitalized, with staff resorting to rubber bullets and chemical agents to regain control. In Louisiana, lawsuits piled up as men described being left in cells without air conditioning during sweltering summers, leading to deaths that courts would later call preventable. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were symptoms of a system unraveling. Advocates argue that the U.S. has built a prison machine too large to control. With nearly 2 million people locked up, the sheer scale overwhelms any attempt at reform. Each new scandal, a guard sentenced for abuse, a prison declared unconstitutional, a riot leaving men dead, only adds to the sense that the system isn't just broken. It's dangerous by design. The people suffering most are those with the least voice. Inmates serving time for drug possession, parole violations, or nonviolent offenses, trapped in environments where violence decides their fate more than the courts ever did. Yet the violence continues to escalate, spilling in. The deaths in Georgia became the flashpoint, but they weren't the end. As families buried their loved ones and investigators issued reports, another tragedy erupted. A federal inmate in Texas, scheduled for release in just weeks, was murdered in his sleep during a nighttime attack. His crime had been minor, his sentence nearly served, yet he never made it home. For many Americans, that single story cut deeper than statistics ever could. It was proof that in today's United States, prison isn't just punishment. It can be a death sentence, even when the judge never ordered it. And so, the cycle continued. Riots, killings, overdoses, abuse. Each headline felt like déjà vu. Each story confirmed the same reality. America's prisons, once billed as places of justice and order, are now among the most dangerous institutions in the nation. Behind those walls, every day is a gamble with survival. For the inmates, for the officers, and for the families waiting outside, the danger is no longer hidden. It's out in the open, undeniable and growing.